And we are back with director Steve Elkins talking about his film Echoes of the Invisible. So when you were putting together the story, how did you decide what stories and people to include, and how did you go about finding those people? Or did you already know some of those people?
I was inspired by what is the connection between these people who seem like they're from very different walks of life, monks, scientists, and artists, and trying to find what that root impulse is that connects people to diverge into those different paths. That's really what sparked the film initially. So what I did was I went out to some environments where I knew scientists were pushing the boundaries of our knowledge, like the Chilean Andes I mentioned earlier. I had, let's see, I'm trying to think. Well, what I discovered very quickly was that scientists and monks, it wasn't just in the southwest of the U.S., around the world, typically they would go to the same environment. So I looked for the most interesting environments in which I'd find both of those people, as well as artists. And that led me to the specific locations that I filmed in, which eventually led me to the people. So this would be obviously the Chilean Andes, to the Himalayas in India, to remote cave monasteries in northern Ethiopia, to Siberia, where I was filming on the frozen surface of the world's oldest, deepest lake, half a mile under the earth in an abandoned iron mine in Minnesota. Lots and lots of extreme locations. One thing I'll add, though, is that the very first person I filmed for the project was the Death Valley runner, Arnold.
Al.
And initially I was going to film the Badwater Marathon, which is an official annual marathon that is held in his honor. They basically some of the craziest runners in the world run the same route he did across Death Valley, but instead of finishing their run at the peak of Mount Whitney, which is the highest point in the continental U.S., they stop at the base of the mountain, basically. And when I tried to film that marathon, I ran into some legal and logistical difficulties, and I basically wasn't allowed to do it. But that's how I discovered that the whole marathon was essentially in this one man's honor, who did it alone with no intention of publicity when he did it in the 70s. And I found that that was a much more intimate and human approach to what I wanted to convey through that insane run. Is it's one blind man's attempt to deal with his inability to orient himself in the world through visuals like most of us can.
And his mental toughness overall, I think, was compelling. You know, and then the sad irony, you know, of him having accomplished this, and then soon thereafter having, I want people to watch the film, but you know, people are going to Google anyway. But you know, tragedy, you know, that would inhibit his ability to do what he seemingly loved most.
Right. And it's interesting because when I was constructing the film, originally I was a little worried that there would be too much overlap between his story and Paul Salopek's, the journalist who's walking across the earth. Because here's one person who's just trying to get across one environment, no matter how extreme. And here's another person who's just, you know, trying to get across the entire earth. But later I realized that tragedy that Al goes through is really the heart of his story and what sets it apart from the others. Because I feel like his journey truly begins when he has to grapple with the tragedy unfolding with his journey.
My wife watched it with me, and she got emotionally choked up, especially when they were talking about some of the people who walked with him on this journey, and some of them would stay on longer. And the one fellow who had stayed on and then eventually had to be life flighted because he had a medical condition he was hiding so he could continue to walk.
Yeah.
I mean, that's some pretty impressive things there. What was your experience like with Paul and his story, and how did it personally affect you?
Well, the specific detail you mentioned about Paul and his walking partners affected me very deeply. I was also very moved by it and felt it was very important to tell as much of their stories as possible. And because ultimately, Echoes of the Invisible, I want the experience of watching it to start out where maybe you're looking at the people, you know, the featured people in the film and thinking, these are extraordinary, mind-blowing people doing seemingly impossible things. But by the end of the movie, I hope that there's a transition in your experience where you start to think, yes, these people are extraordinary, but they're also me. I mean, in the sense that we all have our own untapped capacities and potential that we don't always dip into. And I felt like what Paul reveals through his walk is that what he's doing is actually quite normal. It is extraordinary, but and the film goes into why it's normal, and the fact that that's exemplified by so many of his walking partners, not only wanting to stay on for so long, but accepting challenges that even Paul didn't have to face because they felt that it put them in touch with some aspect of themselves that was missing from their normal lives. I felt that was a really important aspect of it.
Another interesting point I think that the film raised was how being a pedestrian bordered on being criminal, and how we are so expected to be in a vehicle and on some mode of transportation that if you're not on a mode of transportation, there must be something wrong with you. You must be crazy. You must be, or you might just be guilty by virtue of being presumably poor. And so therefore, if you're on foot, something's wrong. There's something nefarious about it. And the fact that he was held up, either arrested or held up or detained so many different times in the course of his journeys in all these different countries simply because he was walking.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I felt like he really illuminated a very profound aspect of our modern experience. And for me, living in Los Angeles, which is very much a car bubble culture, I do feel like he highlighted something I experience here every day, which is that if you don't have a car, you're kind of not a part of the culture, and you're assumed to be homeless, which, in our culture has these weird negative stereotypes about it typically. But traditionally, human beings are nomadic and migratory. But the way that, all kinds of things are set up in our modern world, whether it be political borders or the development of technology, the fact that driving cars is more normal than walking these days, all these things kind of combine to make certain aspects of the human experience seem obscure and archaic, which are actually the most normal things that our bodies are literally biologically built for.
Thus the title echoes of the invisible.
Yeah, that's one of several meanings of the title. Yeah, for sure.
Is Paul still walking now?
He is. The last I spoke to him was, I think, a few months ago, so I'm not exactly sure where he is right now. And usually it's concealed to some degree for security reasons. But the last I talked to him, he was in Myanmar and was attempting to cross the border into China.
Oh, wow.
And it's a very difficult time, of course, at the end of 2020 to be crossing over into China for many reasons.
That's the neck of the woods my wife is from.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, she's from Manipur, India, which is right on the Myanmar border. And ironically, she told me stories of when she was a child and they would go on these 10, 20-mile treks to that border, which is interesting. So how long did it take you to film everything that you needed, given all the places that you went? I got to presume it was a really, really long time.
Well, the full span of time I was working on it was about 7 or 8 years, but I wasn't working on it perpetually through that whole time. It was very intermittent. I'd spend like maybe a few weeks on a trip here, and then I wouldn't do anything for several months, a few weeks on a trip there, and then editing sporadically over the years. So it's hard to say exactly how long it actually took. Honestly, if it were just the filming and editing, it might have taken about a year total, but it was spread out over a very complex 7 or 8 years. Oftentimes because the specific environments I filmed in were very difficult to get into, not just physically and logistically, but sometimes politically. I had to sometimes wait several years to get visas from governments to enter into certain zones. So it was very complex, and I had to have a lot of patience. But, slowing down is one of the themes of the film, the value of it anyway. So I got to live that out myself in the process of making it.
So how did it feel, and where were you when you found out that your film had won the Zeiss Cinematography Award from South by Southwest?
I think I was shopping for some ingredients for a sushi lunch I was making. Yeah. We were supposed to find out at the festival, of course. Yeah. I was planning to be there in person. And so I presumably would have found out at the awards ceremony, but the lockdown started literally just a few days before we flew out and before the festival started. It was right on the cusp. So yeah, I was at home and I got a phone call from one of my producers that we had just won. So that was a very strange experience.
So now you've come to kind of the end of another multi-year project that I think you've been working on, right? So what can we tell us a little bit about that? What can we expect from you next, or what you're allowed to tell us about it, I guess, at this point?
Yeah, I can't completely divulge everything yet, but I am in development on several new projects. There's two documentaries that I'm focusing on pre-production on right now. One of them is how to put this? Well, it's about a writer who is he's relatively well known. But it's actually going to be much more of an experimental film than a traditional documentary. If it goes the way I'm planning it, it's going to involve all kinds of mixed media. It's going to involve not just documentary footage and historical footage, but animation, dance scenes, choreographed dancing, all kinds of bizarre visual effects. But it's kind of a long story.
So Steve, what is the best way for our audience to find and watch Echoes of the Invisible?
You'll find updates on echoesoftheinvisiblefilm.com. We have a distributor, Utopia Films, who will be releasing the film for streaming, I believe, within the next few months. So definitely be looking out for it in early 2021.
Well, and I appreciate having the opportunity to have, kind of, for lack of a better way of putting it, the advanced screening of it, because I'm fancy like that. And thank you so much for being on the show, ladies and gentlemen, director Steve Elkins.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.